The year was 1952. The world was locked in a deep, crystalline chill, not of the weather, but of the soul. The Cold War had moved beyond mere diplomatic friction and into a realm of technological paranoia. Across the vast, lonely stretches of the North American continent, the United States and Canada had begun weaving a web of electronic eyes known as the Pine Tree Line. These were the early sentinels, massive radar dishes positioned to scan the Arctic horizon for the first signs of a Soviet nuclear strike. On a moonless night in late summer, the operators at one of these remote stations were settling into the hypnotic rhythm of the graveyard shift. The radar scopes were green pools of light, the sweeping hand of the beam illuminating only the occasional flight of geese or a stray civilian transport. It was quiet, it was predictable, until the rules of physics were broken. Suddenly, a blip appeared on the edge of the screen. At first, the lead operator assumed it was a ghost return, a fluke of atmospheric temperature inversion. But the signature was too sharp, too solid. He checked the altimeter reading and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The object was at 80,000 feet. In an era where the most advanced bombers struggled to maintain 40,000 feet, this was a mathematical impossibility. Then the object began to move. It didn't accelerate, it simply transitioned from a hover to a speed that defied the capabilities of any known engine. On the scope, the paint of the target jumped across the screen in jagged, impossible leaps. When the object reached the center of the display, it performed a maneuver that should have torn any airframe to pieces. It changed direction by 90 degrees without slowing down, maintaining a velocity estimated at over 3,000 miles per hour. The station commander was called to the deck. His first instinct was that the equipment had suffered a catastrophic failure. He ordered a diagnostic on the vacuum tubes and the microwave transmitters. But as he reached for the secure line to report the malfunction, the radio crackled. Another station, 200 miles to the west, was seeing the exact same thing. Then a third. This wasn't a glitch in the hardware. This was something physical, something massive, and something that was moving through American airspace with a total disregard for the laws of gravity and momentum. The operators watched in a stunned, heavy silence as the blip traced a path across their screens that no aircraft in the world should have been able to fly. At the nearest Air Defense Command base, the scramble hooter tore through the silence of the barracks. Pilots, men who had survived the flak-filled skies of Germany and the dogfights over the Yalu River in Korea, sprinted to their hangars. Within minutes, 2 F-94 Starfire interceptors were screaming down the runway, their afterburners twin spears of blue flame cutting through the dark. The pilots were guided by ground control, their voices tight with the professional urgency of a real-world intercept. "Target is 12 o'clock, high," the controller crackled. "Estimate altitude now exceeding 90,000 feet." The lead pilot tilted his head back, looking through the canopy. High above him, far beyond the ceiling of his straining jet, he saw it. It wasn't a glint of metal or a flashing navigation light. It was a brilliant, pulsating orb of white-blue light. It hung there, stationary against the stars, a silent intruder in the upper atmosphere. "I have visual," the pilot reported. "Object is... It's bright, extremely bright. No visible wings, no tail, no exhaust trail." As the Starfires climbed, their engines began to gasp for air in the thinning atmosphere. The pilots pushed their aircraft to the absolute limit, the airframes vibrating as they approached their coffin corner, the narrow margin between a high-speed stall and structural failure. They were at 45,000 feet, their service ceiling. The object remained miles above them, untouchable. Then, as if sensing the pursuit, the light began to move. One pilot described it as drifting initially, before it suddenly surged. There was no engine noise, only the roar of the interceptor's own struggling turbines. The object simply stayed out of reach, maintaining a perfect mocking distance as the jets climbed. When the lead pilot attempted to lock his radar onto the target, his scope was immediately flooded with chaff or electronic interference. Within seconds, the object accelerated vertically. It didn't bank or climb in a curve. It shot straight up, shrinking into a pinprick of light before vanishing into the blackness of the mesosphere. The pilots were left alone in the thin air, their fuel gauges dropping, staring at an empty sky that had just been occupied by something that didn't belong to the 20th century. The debriefing lasted for 18 hours. The pilots were separated, placed in windowless rooms, and asked to sketch what they had seen. The radar operators were flown to a central command hub, their logs confiscated and replaced with blank sheets. There was a palpable sense of panic in the higher echelons of the Pentagon. For years, rumors of flying saucers had been the province of supermarket tabloids and rural witnesses. But this was different. This encounter had been tracked by multiple million-dollar radar arrays. It had been witnessed by decorated combat pilots. It had occurred over sensitive military installations. In the official log of the encounter, the Air Force was forced to use a term that had only recently been coined to replace the more whimsical flying saucer. The event was logged as an unidentified flying object, UFO. This wasn't a civilian report. It wasn't a conspiracy theory born in a backyard. It was a formal admission by the United States Air Force that their airspace had been violated by a craft whose performance characteristics were decades, perhaps centuries beyond their own. The report was stamped with the highest level of secrecy within hours. It was funneled into a fledgling investigation that would eventually be known as Project Blue Book. To the public, the Air Force issued a standard dismissal, attributing the radar returns to weather balloons and the pilots' visual sightings to celestial phenomena or mass hysteria. But behind the closed doors of the Air Defense Command, the mood was one of existential dread. If the Soviets had developed a craft that could hover at 100,000 feet and travel at Mach 5, the Cold War was already over. Decades passed. The Tybee bombs and the lost generals of the Second World War moved from the headlines to the history books. The UFO encounter of 1952 became a classic of the paranormal, cited by enthusiasts as proof of extraterrestrial visitation. The military, for its part, stayed silent, allowing the rumors of little green men to act as a convenient screen for a much more earthly truth. In the late 1990s, a cache of documents was declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, and the reality of the 1952 encounter finally emerged. The object was not extraterrestrial. It was not from a distant star system, nor was it a product of Soviet engineering. It was American. It was a prototype aircraft developed under a program so clandestine that even the most senior Air Force commanders, the men who had scrambled the interceptors that night, were never informed it existed. The project was known internally as the Project Silverbug, or the WS-606A. It was a radical departure from traditional aviation. It utilized a revolutionary radial flow gas turbine engine designed to create a cushion of air around a circular, wingless airframe. It was a flying saucer in the most literal sense, designed to exploit the Coanda effect to achieve vertical takeoff and incredible speeds at the very edge of space. The pulsating light reported by the pilots, that was the ionization of the air around the craft's highly charged electrical skin, a byproduct of an experimental propulsion system that the military was testing for high-altitude reconnaissance. The impossible maneuvers were the result of a gimbaled thrust system that allowed the craft to change direction without the need for traditional control surfaces. The Air Force had used its own pilots as unwitting test subjects. They wanted to see if their most advanced radars could track the craft and how their best interceptors would perform against it. They had allowed the UFO myth to grow because it was the perfect cover. If the public believed in aliens, they wouldn't look for the secret hangars in the Nevada desert. The night radar broke the rules wasn't a message from another world. It was a glimpse into a future that the military was building in the dark. A future where the most dangerous weapon in the sky was the one that everyone believed was a ghost. In the early 1950s, the concept of stealth didn't exist in the public lexicon. Aviation was dominated by the pursuit of raw power, bigger engines, louder afterburners, and more aggressive profiles. But inside the compartmentalized hangars of the black project sites, a small group of engineers was obsessed with a different goal: disappearance. The aircraft that triggered the 1952 panic was a radical departure from everything that had come before. It had no conventional shape. There were no tail fins, no protruding wings, and no sharp right angles. It was a smooth, lenticular disc, a geometry specifically chosen because it possessed a naturally low radar cross-section. But the engineers went further. The surface of the craft wasn't just polished aluminum, it was coated in a primitive but effective radar-absorbent material, a mixture of iron carbonyl and specialized resins designed to trap incoming microwave pulses rather than reflecting them back to the ground stations. This was the birth of stealth technology, decades before the F-117 Nighthawk would become a household name. The thermal signature was equally revolutionary. In an era where jet engines left a massive heat trail that glowed like a beacon on early infrared sensors, this craft utilized a sophisticated mixing system. Its engine exhaust was cooled by passing it through an array of bypass vents before it exited the rim of the disk, diffusing the heat into the frigid air of the upper atmosphere. At the time, this level of thermal and electronic masking sounded like science fiction, even to the most senior aerospace engineers at Lockheed or Douglas. It was a ghost machine, designed to haunt the skies without leaving a trace. The secrecy surrounding the project was not merely strict, it was absolute. It existed in a black cell, a budgetary and administrative void where the traditional rules of military oversight simply did not apply. This wasn't a standard Air Force program, it was a Special Access Program, or SAP, that bypassed the usual chain of command. Not even the most trusted allies were given a glimpse behind the curtain. The Royal Air Force, despite their close cooperation with American intelligence, was kept completely in the dark. NATO commanders, responsible for the defense of the very airspace the craft was testing, were never briefed. Even senior Pentagon officials, men with 4 stars on their shoulders and top-secret clearances, were denied access to the full details. The reasoning behind this extreme isolation was cold and calculated. The aircraft's very existence was considered more dangerous than enemy bombs. If the Soviets caught wind that the U.S. had mastered high-altitude, low-absorbent flight, they would have accelerated their own surface-to-air missile programs or triggered a preemptive strike to close the technological gap. The weapon was so potent that the risk of a leak was deemed more significant than the risk of the project failing. It was a secret so heavy that the American government was willing to let its own people believe in extraterrestrial invasions rather than admit the truth. The night of the 1952 encounter wasn't an accident, it was a stress test. The aircraft was tasked with a reconnaissance run that would take it directly through the most heavily monitored radar corridors in North America. Its job was simple, but terrifyingly high stakes: prove that no radar on Earth could track it reliably. The pilot of the secret craft was operating under strict radio silence. He was flying at the very edge of the stratosphere, looking down on the world through a specialized optics system. Below him, the Pine Tree Line radar stations were sweeping the sky, unaware that their target was already in their midst. The test worked, perhaps too well. The stealth coatings and the cooled exhaust didn't make the craft completely invisible. Instead, it made it look unnatural on the radar scopes. It appeared as a flickering, high-speed ghost that defied the standard tracking algorithms. To the radar operators, the erratic signal didn't look like a plane. It looked like something from another world. The very technology intended to make the craft a ghost ended up making it a celebrity. The UFO panic that gripped the nation that night was in reality the sound of the world's most advanced air defense system failing to understand the future of warfare. As the blip danced across the screens of the Air Defense Command, the confusion on the ground rapidly escalated into a crisis. The commanders in the radar bunkers didn't have the luxury of wondering if it was a secret American project. Their job was to defend the sky against a Soviet threat. To them, an unidentified object moving at Mach 3 over sensitive airspace was a declaration of war. Fighter jets were already in pursuit, but as they failed to close the distance, the command turned to their final option, the ground-based defenses. Battery commanders for the burgeoning surface-to-air missile sites were ordered to red alert. Guidance radars began to lock on, and the launch sequences for the first generation of Nike missiles were initiated. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the United States came dangerously close to firing on its own billion-dollar secret. The interceptors were struggling, the missile batteries were humming, and the order to fire for effect was seconds away. Disaster was only averted by a last-minute flash priority-coded abort. A shadowy liaison officer at the Pentagon, one of the few men who knew the truth, recognized the coordinates and the altitude profile being reported through the emergency channels. He bypassed the entire command structure, using a secure direct line to the regional air defense hub. A single cryptic code word was transmitted. The missile crews stood down. The interceptors were ordered to return to base. The UFO was allowed to vanish into the night, leaving behind a trail of terrified witnesses and a military establishment that would spend decades lying about what it had almost destroyed. In the cold gray light of the morning following the 1952 encounter, the American intelligence community faced a staggering dilemma. They had a secret aircraft that worked, one that had successfully evaded the nation's most sophisticated air defenses, but in doing so, it had left a trail of witnesses from the radar pits of the Pine Tree Line to the cockpits of the Starfire interceptors. The military could not simply erase the memory of the event, they had to replace it. It was here that one of the most successful psychological operations in history was born. To hide the truth of Project Silverbug and its radical propulsion systems, officials did something counterintuitive. They allowed, and in some cases encouraged, the UFO rumors to spread. They realized that if the public believed the impossible speeds and strange lights were the work of extraterrestrials, the trail would lead away from the secret Nevada test sites and toward the stars. The extraterrestrial hypothesis was a perfect, impenetrable shield. If a journalist or a curious civilian got too close to the truth of high-altitude stealth, they could be dismissed as a saucer nut or a conspiracy theorist. The myth was safer than the reality. A public preoccupied with little green men wouldn't ask why the Air Force was diverting millions of dollars in black budget funds to anonymous aerospace contractors. They wouldn't notice the strange circular shadows moving across the high desert runways at midnight. By validating the mystery of the unidentified, the military was able to preserve the secrecy of the identified. The UFO era wasn't just a cultural phenomenon, it was a state-sponsored shadow play designed to keep the most advanced technology on the planet hidden in plain sight. Despite its breathtaking performance on that summer night in 1952, the disc-shaped prototype was never destined for mass production. It was a technological pioneer, a proof of concept that had pushed the boundaries of aeronautics into a realm of extreme fragility. The aircraft flew only a handful of missions. While it could reach the edges of space and outrun any interceptor in the world, it was a nightmare to maintain. The radial flow engines were temperamental, prone to catastrophic heat warping of the internal turbines. The ionization of the air, the very thing that created that eerie, pulsating blue-white glow, frequently short-circuited the primitive onboard electronics. It was an aircraft that required a literal army of specialized technicians for every hour of flight time. Beyond the mechanical issues, it was simply too expensive. During a period when the United States was trying to build a fleet of thousands of conventional bombers and fighters, a single disc-shaped interceptor cost more than an entire squadron of B-47s. Once its basic concepts were proven, specifically the feasibility of stealth and high-altitude wingless flight, the project was quietly shelved. The prototypes were not sent to museums or displayed at air shows. Their blueprints were shredded, and their specialized alloys melted down. Officially, the craft never existed. It became a non-thing, a ghost in the machine of history. The engineers were reassigned to other black projects, sworn to a silence that most would take to their graves. The future had arrived, looked around, and been put back into its box because the world wasn't yet ready to pay the price for it. The silence held for nearly 50 years. It wasn't until the late 1990s and the early years of the 21st century that the declassification of Project Blue Book and the release of Project Silverbug documents began to peel back the layers of the deception. When historians and aerospace analysts began to cross-reference these files, they noticed something unsettling. The dates of the most impossible UFO sightings of the early Cold War, sightings reported by credible military witnesses and tracked on radar, matched perfectly with the flight logs and test schedules of the secret aircraft programs. The West Hills sighting of 53, the Great Lakes ghost of 54, they weren't anomalous events, they were test flights. The mystery wasn't visitors from space, it was human technology running far ahead of its time. The public had spent decades looking for alien life, never realizing that the visitors were actually their own neighbors, working in windowless offices in Burbank or Dayton. The documents revealed a world where the gap between public knowledge and military capability wasn't just wide, it was a chasm. We were looking for signs of intelligence from the stars, unaware that the most intelligent machines ever built were already circling above us, draped in the invisibility of a classified seal. As we look back at the footage of graining radar screens and listen to the frantic voices of pilots from the 1950s, the narrative finally shifts. The aircraft that terrified North America in 1952 didn't come from another world, but in every way that mattered, it felt like it did. It represented a future that no one, not even the generals who scrambled the jets, was ready to see. It was a machine of contradictions, a weapon designed to protect a country that didn't know it existed, a craft that was a failure as a product, but a triumph as a concept. Its legacy isn't found in a museum, but in the stealth bombers and high-altitude drones that dominate modern warfare today. They are the descendants of the ghosts of 1952. Sometimes the most unbelievable sightings aren't alien. They aren't the result of mass hysteria or celestial flukes. They are classified. They are the moments when the curtain of the present slips, allowing us a brief, terrifying glimpse of the future being built in the dark. The UFO era wasn't a story of first contact. It was the story of a world that was being haunted by its own ingenuity. A world where the most dangerous things in the sky were the ones we were told didn't exist at all.